Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As part of our Pluxee International Women's Days initiative, Pluxee UK launched a webinar series called Women in Tech Empowerment. This series hosted by our women leaders with featuring experts from the industry, focusing on gender issues, specifically women in tech. And today I am thrilled to host our special guest, Dr. Rohini Anand. She is joining us from DC. Rohini has been leading Sodexo D&I journey as the Global Chief Diversity Officer when I met with her. She is a great leader, global thought leader, and the author of a great book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. A book that many leaders, organizations use it to define their D&I strategies for their business. She is the most inspirational advocate I have ever met, specifically for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not only with her professional and experience and knowledge, with her passion and commitment on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Welcome, Rohini. Heartfelt thank you for being with us today. Could you please introduce yourself to us?
Sure. Thank you, Burchin. As I said to you before we started this call, when you ask me to do something, I don't refuse. So it's absolutely my pleasure to be on this call with you. And I think you introduced me well. I work for Sodexo, and that's where I met you. I was actually originally hired at Sodexo in North America. And I was hired at a very difficult time in the company's history when they were facing a discrimination lawsuit filed by their African American managers in North America. So I like to say that, with the leadership commitment, we changed that narrative from class action to best in class because we became leaders in DEI. I think the executives and the leaders saw the benefit of an inclusive culture to the organization, but also to business. So when the CEO moved into a global role, he asked me to replicate this work globally. And so in North America, I'd led diversity, equity, inclusion, corporate responsibility, and wellness, and then continued to lead DEI globally, diversity, equity, and inclusion globally. I left Sodexo just before COVID hit. And, I said I rewired from Sodexo. So it was not retired, but rewired. And I decided to use the COVID time to write my book that Burchin mentioned. And so today I do a couple of things. I do keynotes and book talks. I mentor the next generation. I do executive engagement. And the part that really takes up a lot of my time and that I love is my board work. So I'm on two for-profit boards, including Sanofi's Diversity Advisory Board and Spectrum TV Charter Communications, which is a US company. And then I'm on the board of one of Gates Foundation initiatives, something called Tent Partnership, which places refugees worldwide. So happy to be here and to, engage in this conversation with you.
Thank you for this introduction. Before we go to the more specific topics, I just want to ask you. I know a little bit, but I want to ask and share with the rest of the participants what inspired you to pursue a career in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what keeps you motivated to continue for that?
Well, what inspired me was my own personal journey because I think, as anyone knows, this work is very personal. So everyone has a personal narrative that draws them to this work. And certainly that's the case for me. So I grew up in Mumbai, India, surrounded by others who pretty much look like me. I belong to the majority religion, Hinduism, and, saw myself as sort of the center of the world growing up in India. I moved to North America as a young single woman student. And it was that move that was an inflection point in my journey, both literally and figuratively. So it was the first time that I, was identified as a minority, as a foreigner, as an immigrant. And that was a whole new experience for me. Growing up in India, surrounded by others who were like me, I hadn't reflected on my privilege. But once I was identified as a minority, it shook my world. I went from being someone who saw herself as a center of her world to being an outsider and other. And it was at that point that I began to recognize the privilege that I had had growing up as a majority. I was growing up, as part of the majority. I hadn't reflected on my privilege, but certainly when I had this, experience as a minority, I started reflecting on my privilege, and that was, a whole new experience for me. So my calling was basically to level the playing field. It was to, provide opportunities for everyone. And I like to say that my vocation and my avocation are perfectly aligned. And why I continue this work is for the next generation, for my children and for my grandchildren, to make sure that they inherit a world where they can do and be whatever they want to do and be. So it was my experience growing up, moving to North America, moving from someone who is part of a majority to being a minority, and the experiences that came with that, and recognizing the privileges that those who are part of a majority have, and my responsibility then to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity. Does that answer your question?
I think absolutely, and I know your story and your narrative very well. So I can recognize what makes you so passionate. I have a different story. Many of the participants also know. I will not go to the detail. That makes me also driven, committed, to really give back something for the next generation, for our daughters and for their kids and so on. And that is really important if it comes from your own heart, heartfelt passion.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to give a little bit some context why we have this woman in tech on our webinars. In Sodexo, as you said, diversity, equity, and inclusion become a very strong legacy. That we were really one of the leading companies across the world about this, and you have been driving this for many, many years. And I have the privilege to work with you, specifically on the global advisory board for Sodexo for the gender equality. And in January 2024, Pluxee spun off from Sodexo and became a standalone employee benefits and engagement company. When we also launched our global strategy, growth ambitions, and ESG strategy, aiming to continue to create a positive ecosystem with impact and inclusive culture for everyone. Gender equality is one of our key pillars. And today, we also acknowledge globally and locally that women represents 50% of the humanity, yet the technology only held 27.6% as a woman of the tech position. And Pluxee's women in tech is also around 27% globally and locally. So that's why this year we started to focus more on women in tech. And my first question is, a lot of research shows that diverse teams significantly impact innovation and problem solving, especially within the technology topics. And what do you think about this? And could you please share some of your opinion and insights about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of research, Burchan, that bears out what you just said. First of all, in the tech areas, there's a lot of research that correlates the number of patents with a diverse organization and an inclusive culture. And that, patents are the sort of the hallmark of technology. There's plenty of research out there that demonstrates the connection between DEI and business outcomes. So companies with more diverse leadership teams report higher innovation revenue and also better financial performance. So one of the studies basically looks at companies with below average diversity scores, and what they find is that in those companies they report 26% innovation revenue, but the companies with above average diversity scores report 45% average innovation revenue. So there's a clear difference between, these organizations. And there's also better financial performance, both shareholder value, as well as return on equity, as well as EBIT margins that are 9 percentage points higher for those companies that are diversity leaders as compared to other companies that have below average representation of diversity in their management teams. And this research is borne out by Credit Suisse, by McKinsey, by Catalyst, and many other studies. But the other piece, Burchin, is so there's clearly there's a benefit, right? Your question was about the impact of innovation and problem solving. So there's clearly demonstrated benefit of diversity in terms of better performance. But the other piece is that improving gender and ethnic diversity in technology globally has the potential of generating 430 billion to 530 billion in new value in technology. And that, it could also generate from 0.5% to 0.6% of incremental GDP, which is, if you look at it, the size of the economy of Norway or the size of the economy of Taiwan. And the sad part is that despite all these studies, women make up, if I just look at the United States where I am, because you gave the global figures, 52% of the US population that's over 21, 40% of STEM degree holders, and only 29% of the technology STEM workforce. And globally, you said it was, 27%, I believe, of tech positions. So, it boggles the mind if the data suggests it leads to innovation, it leads to better financial performance. Why are we not doing better in terms of representation? But I think it's not just the representation. It is about having more diversity, women, ethnic minorities, all diversity in the organization. But it's also about an inclusive culture, because very often it's the culture that's the barrier. Even if you have the representation, but you don't have a culture which allows everyone to contribute to their fullest potential, then you're really not harnessing the power of the people you have there, of that diversity. So let me just stop there.
I think you already I started to give me more insights for my next question, but I think that is really eye-opener for me. Then when you look at the data and when you see the impacts in many countries where you have these diversified teams in tech or also in other aspects, we see all the benefits. But I think we have to say there is still, a lot of things to do. And what are the key blockers or challenges in promoting, this diversity and the inclusive culture, specifically for the technology fields? I am really having a big time why we cannot progress, although we have all the evidence that will help to the economy, to the individuals, to the global. And so what are these key blockers and challenges, you think?
Yeah, so, I think you're absolutely right. It's not just about getting people in the door, because hiring individuals is one thing. But what's really shocking is that women leave at a much higher rate than men, for example. So the quit rate for women in technology is 53%, compared to 31% for men. I think this is a US figure, not global perhaps, but 53%. So, it's like a revolving door. It's ridiculous. And why? I think that's the question you asked. And I think it's a really good question. There are many reasons. I think, and again, there's studies on this. Very often, women are the only, right? And it is really disheartening to be the only, to be the voice that is, you don't feel like speaking up when you are the only. I remember very clearly, in fact, we both have daughters, Burchin. And I remember clearly that my daughters went to a STEM, a technology high school. And I remember when my daughter came home and she said to me, she said, because she was one of maybe a handful of girls in that program in high school. They were mostly boys. And she said, Mom, when the teacher asks a question, the boys all raise their hand. and they give the answers, but they're always wrong. So she knew the right answer, but she was reluctant to really speak up and share it because she was one of the only voices in that room. So I think that can become really disheartening when you are the only person. The other thing that research shows very clearly is that 82% of women, this is globally, say that their contributions are ignored or they're spoken over, or somebody else takes what they've said and says it in a different way, and suddenly it's heard differently. So it's not the message but the messenger that is given the credence and heard differently. And that is a big, because innovation, the ideas that spark innovation are the currency in technology, right? So that's the other piece. But I think, and then the other barrier that I would say is stereotypes that for some reason, men are better than women in the STEM fields. Okay, so they're given more attention, etc. But I would say the one big factor that women actually track off or leave, or sometimes are reluctant to join, is because of a hostile work environment. You know, I mean, the statistics are shocking, Burchin. 60 to 70% of women in technology in China, Brazil, and India report sexual harassment. 60 to 70% in technology fields. And in the US, that figure is equally shocking, 52%. I mean, it's unacceptable. So I think by that it is being diminished, being talked over, being harassed, whatever it is. So that hostile work environment is one that sometimes women decide that they don't want and they leave. So there's an opportunity for organizations that can truly change their culture, that can truly get male allies on board, that will win this battle for talent of women. And I can maybe share some examples also of what in leadership in particular, how that works and what companies have done. But this becomes even more challenging when you get to leadership, Burchin.
Mhm. So I understand the culture is still a blocker. Having men allies, especially in STEM, is really, I mean, it's really need
Mm-hmm.
to be improved. Even the day before, I was on Monday, is it yesterday? So I was in a startup kind of workshop where we met with some startups with several leaders from different sectors, and it was mostly technology startups. And at some point, we were talking about the talents, and one of the gentlemen made a comment say, nowadays I see women are doing also much better. I can assess they are getting better and better. I didn't even understand what he was referring to. I said, specifically what? In technology, I see more women and they might be really good in the long term. And I said, I also see some men
Right.
getting better, but also getting worse. This still bias, in STEM, you
Absolutely.
know, this is there, and I am in UK. I don't want to judge anyone. Of course, there are different thoughts and different people always, but I see when it comes to STEM, I feel this is much more on the starting point rather than in general. When I see women empowerment, it is getting better and better every day from this bias. But in STEM, I feel there is a long way on the culture, on the bias, and we need to work on this. I think there is no other way for that, most probably. That's why I think this gender gap, especially in leadership position, is a
Mm.
big challenge at the moment. That's what we see. And what do you think about that for the technology roles, the gender gap in leadership
Yeah,
positions?
Burchin, honestly, in the technology industry, I think women encounter inequality, more gender equality than other workforce populations. It's a very sad statement because that's the growth industry. That's where we need every talent we can get. That's good, but there's still such a big gap. Um, I mean, even in Silicon Valley, you have a lot of men leading companies, right? And a lot of men of Indian origin very often. But only 11% of all executive positions in Silicon Valley are women. I mean, that's really, the leadership roles are maybe a little higher, but 11%. Um, and the other thing that we have to remember also is that not all women have the same experience, because those with intersectional identities, like being a woman and an ethnic minority, like I am in the United States, I'm a woman, I'm an Asian American, are often the double onlys, right? So, I mean, if I look at the United States, women of color, so Hispanic, Asian American, African American, Native American, hold less than 10% of computing roles. I mean, that is unacceptable. White women, it's also low, 16%, but there is a gap there. So I think we've got to get more nuanced in how we even look at our data, because people have different experiences based on their intersecting identities. And, I mean, CIO roles, 18% in the United States. In, I think it's in Latin America, it's 13%. And if I'm not mistaken, Burchin, in the UK, in China, and in many of the African countries, it's 11%. So, we have a long ways to go. Clearly, women are having a hard time surviving the culture. They're having a hard time advancing their careers. There's a lot of work to be done to, address these gaps, particularly in leadership. I mean, clearly we have people that come into, that get degrees, sometimes come in and then decide, I'm not going to deal with this. So, unfortunate, but I think, the culture has to change, and we've got to really work with male allies to help to change that culture and to ensure that we have an inclusive culture.
I think we all have a role to play. That's what I feel. 2 years ago, our CIO was assigned to another job within Pluxee, and we were in the middle of a big transformation project for technology, and we were really in a very, very difficult position. We started a search for a new CIO, and our search company is aware about our diversity and inclusion strategies. They always bring us a balanced, diversified candidate stake. And we said we need someone in 1 month time and we cannot afford this, etc. And then she came back to me and to our HR director 2 weeks later. She said, I have good candidates, but I'm sorry, I will have no woman candidate because you are under pressure of time. Either you have to compromise or I have to come to you with the men-dominated candidate list. We take our time. We said, no, okay, we take this time and we waited. And today we have a CIO, a woman CIO, but it took us 5 months. I can recognize it's not easy. There is not so many also leaders, women leaders in tech, but it requires that everybody takes some, compromise to get to the right balance. And today I am very passionate person with having a diversified organization. Now Eleni is also like that. She's pushing hard to mentor, to take her time for this time, for this kind of, activities to encourage more women. But I think we all need to play a role to really progress on this.
Yeah,
That's
no, I would agree 100%. Clearly.
Can you give us some companies where or you help them, create pathways for women and other underrepresented groups to enter and thrive in tech, and which has also real impacts? Could you share that kind of specific some examples with us, maybe?
Yeah, so I'm reluctant to give company names because
Of
honestly,
course, yes.
Gurchan, what happens is, this is always a moment in time, right? It depends on the leadership, it depends on the strategies, and that can change overnight. Change in leaders, change in strategy means you can slide right back to ground zero. So, best practices in any organization are in a moment in time, depending on who's leading it. So, So with, but I think that going back to your example around recruiting, I think the intentionality is absolutely critical, because you've got to stay focused. You've got to be intentional. Sometimes it takes more time. But if you, and particularly at a senior leadership position, you've got to be very intentional about, how you're going about it. But if you look at the next levels down, I think there are certain things that I have found to be very important, because particularly when stereotypes and biases come into play, having a diverse interview panel. So it's not one person making the decision. Usually it's a man, because he's the one in the senior leadership roles. But having a little bit more, of a panel and some diversity in the panel makes a big difference, because then you have multiple inputs and you have people checking each other's biases, to say, well, if you think that we shouldn't hire her because she has young children and won't be able to keep the hours, I don't think so. She's the best qualified candidate. And I think she's got the degree, she's got the work experience. We need to give her a chance and let her decide. So I think, those kinds of things work very well. And I think also looking at sort of non-traditional places. So I know one of the things that you do, Burchin, is to also look at, when it's not a search firm, but also look at organizations that are technology organizations where you have women who are members, and building a brand in those places is very important. I think the wording of job descriptions, I have found that to be very critical, because there's certain things you have to really look at it and examine, what is this saying to people? If you're just don't put in things for the sake of putting it in, that 90% travel. Well, if it is 90% travel, then it's fine. But frequently things can be done remotely, virtually, etc. But, I think that some of the examples really, I think one of the big things is mentoring and sponsorship. And that's where I have seen makes a very big difference, because, women don't necessarily advocate for themselves. And getting the right mentor, getting the right sponsor, I think makes a huge difference, because a sponsor, a mentor is someone who speaks with you, helps you to position yourself, build your brand, etc. Hone your skills, develop certain areas where they think that you might need development, where you think you may need development. But a sponsor is somebody that, comes in and talks about you and makes you visible to the organization. And I think that, can go a very, very long way. So I think that's one that I have found. I'll give you an example in a minute, but I think that the sponsorship and mentorship, I think the other piece is flexibility options, and having managers who don't, sort of penalize people for taking flex options. I think that's very important, because women are ambitious, they're very eager. But I think the other piece is where, in one organization that I worked with, they were not so well known as a technology company, Burchin, but they built their brand as a leader in their culture and in hiring women. And there were some leaders that joined. One woman I remember in particular that joined the organization, bypassed other technology organizations to join this organization that wasn't very well known, because of the brand they had developed as a leader for their culture for women. So I think, what that organization did was they provided mentors and sponsors to help women advance their careers. They had career path guidance. So I think that kind of stuff. Let me give you one other example from India, one organization that I worked with, which is very interesting. In India, 42% of STEM grads, so computer science and engineering, are women, 42%, compared to only 12 to 18% in the United States. So it's huge. 38% of entry-level jobs are held by women in India. Okay, 38. And then when I mentioned to you, right, 70% experience sexual harassment, and about 50% experience what they call performance bias. So at the end of the day, you have just 7% women in executive positions. So you start off, as I said, with 42% of STEM grads, end up with 7% in executive positions. So there's a huge drop-off rate. But what this organization did was a couple of things. They, provided flex time. They provided sabbaticals, they provided long maternity leaves, and worked with the women to come back after maternity leave. And the other thing they did was they worked with the men, the leaders, to really address the culture. So the men were mentors and sponsors, but they themselves ensured with intentionality that the culture was inclusive. So I think these are some of the things, but let me just close with one other piece. I think there are things that women can do as well, right? So as you said, it's everybody's role, and there are things women can do, because very often women don't ask for what they want. They don't self promote, right? So I think women have to be able to also raise their hand, even if they're the only, and it takes courage. And I'm not putting this all on fixing the women. I think first the culture has to be fixed, because it's a catch 22 position, right? It's a chicken and egg position. What comes first? But and also network, build relationships, because I think that's important, and be intentional about who you are, your brand, what you want, and then seek out sponsors in an organization that may not have a formal sponsorship. And I think the other piece, like you said about your CIO and yourself, women need to develop proteges also, and also women need to be authentic about their own leadership style. You don't have to imitate everything. So I mean, I think those are some examples, and I can talk a little bit more at some point about sort of sponsorship and mentorship in the role of leaders. So
I think I'm just really, when you're talking, I'm also reflecting how we see the development of women, not only in tech, also sponsorship and mentorship plays for me a big role. And also role modeling, to see some role models, that
right.
makes a big difference. I feel in technology, this mentorship, especially sponsorship, plays more critical role, because when you are a client-facing role in junior level, like me, I was in product, in client-facing, you have more visibility to the leadership, because always client topics are on the leadership top priority. But when you are in technology, your visibility is not so easy, being with a client or something. I think having this kind of opportunities with a sponsor makes it really much more stronger. Otherwise, you are always internally focused on developing this technology and lose your visibility opportunities. Again, another example, we have a great woman in RIT, a young architecture. 2 years ago, we have a global project where UK was more involved, and she became part of this project, a small part. But now, whenever we have an important project, they reach out us to us and ask for her, project leadership or different opportunities, because she was so visible and they saw her capabilities, her performance. It was really important. But I feel this sponsorship and mentorship, maybe you can give us a little bit more information how it should be structured, because it needs to be a little bit, well organized and structured, that
Yeah.
people take the lead on this. Can you a little bit
Yeah,
elaborate this?
yeah. So let me start with a quick story. So, one organization that I worked with, right? So this is sort of two parts to it. One is about male allyship, and the other is about sponsorship. So, in this particular organization, the leader was, very resistant to all the business case benefits that we just talked about. He was like, okay, so what? But so we got him involved in a cross company mentoring program. So this individual mentored a woman from a different organization. She was on the leadership team of that on the executive team, right? So I don't know if she was in technology or not, but she was on the executive team of that organization. So they built a very trusting relationship with each other. And what happened was that this woman got laid off, and she had built a trusting relationship with him and shared with him stories about being the only woman on the executive team, about being talked over, about being diminished, and finally she got laid off. And it didn't happen in a very good way. It was a very sort of a very challenging the way they did it. So this leader then came to me and he said If a woman had been laid off in an organization, I would have said, so what? This happens to men, it happens to women anywhere in an organization. But after listening to her story, so this was the same man who said, all you need is to work hard and you'll succeed, and I don't believe in the business case, etc. He said, I don't want this happening on my watch in my organization. It's unacceptable. It should not happen. Um, so that's the allyship piece, right? So the storytelling, the story sharing, it shifted his perspective, and he decided that this was something he was going to take on, despite intellectually initially having resisted it. So he had the courage to take it on, and he didn't stop there. So he had the commitment. So he had the curiosity to listen to her story. He had the courage to say, look, what I was thinking originally was wrong. So that's what allyship does. You have to have the curiosity, the courage, and the commitment. And then he had the commitment. So what he did was he went ahead and he asked that all 12 of his direct reports sponsor, mentor. He called it mentoring, mentor somebody who, from a different part of the organization. Now, of the 12 of them, 9 of them went on to lead big portfolios of business, become country heads. That sponsorship. It wasn't that they were not talented before, that they didn't have the skills, but they were made visible to the organization. All of a sudden, this talent became visible to the organization. Sort of like, the example you shared about the gender advisory board, right, at Sodexo. Being appointed to that makes the individuals visible to the organization. But in this case, it was a step further, because those executives that sponsored or mentored these women actually talked about them in different places. So, you're talking about the structure. I think mentoring, it can be informal, so you can seek out a mentor informally, but it can also be a little bit more structured or formal. And my recommendation is that any of these efforts need to be in conjunction with the talent management process, because what you need is to identify your high performers, right, your high potential talent, and ensure that they stay. Women in tech, that they stay. So if they're a high performer, make sure you get them a sponsor who can guide their career trajectory, who can speak for them in the right places, who can make them visible to the organization. So I think it has to be sort of part of a talent process. But I shared that story because it really demonstrates two things: the power of allyship and the power of sponsorship. And if I can share one more quick story on that. So the story didn't end there, Burchin, because what happened was one of those leaders actually mentored a woman who managed a high security facility. Okay. Now, and I mentioned this because her leadership style, was collaborative, was low key. And he came to me afterwards and he said, if you had presented me with a male and a female candidate and said, identify the right person for this high security facility, it's sort of like saying, you have a male and a female candidate. There's this tech job that I need to hire for. And your bias kicks in and you say, well, men are much better at technology. Men can do these long hours. Men have, can, etc., etc. But he says, because she's so effective and her leadership style is different, he said, I'll never let that bias come into play in selection processes. So, I think it's important to have systems in place, like diverse interview panels, like, telling your recruiter that I will wait till we find the right candidate. So the systems, the processes are important, but it's also the people. People need to manage their biases. So it's, really, to do this, it has to be at the intersection of people and processes. Both have to come together in order that, we really get the right culture that will, allow diverse talent, including women, to thrive. So, long
I think
answer to a short
no,
question.
I think it's really very, very, reflective again. Now, when I think this bias is always a problem, but when you start talking, intersecting, and you tell that you feel like that, people also get aware, that might be really something I need to think. But if you never react, and then people find it granted or something, that is really both sided. I think talking to each other, sharing the right feelings when you have this bias is really critical also to manage that kind of thing. But mentoring, sponsorship, I think I found it, and I am lucky. I mean, privileged to be in Plaxi and Sodexo because we have a lot of processes and structural way of working. I have been sponsored. I have been sponsoring for many people, and then you see if it's working. It is big, pleasure for the
Right.
business
I'm
actually.
wondering, Burchin, do you think we could also see if the audience has any questions in the chat? I
I
don't
think we have some
know.
questions. I already saw one.
Oh,
Maybe
great.
I will. Maybe I have one more question. Then I go
Yeah,
to
okay,
the
sure.
audience questions.
Great.
Please raise your question on the Q&A part. We will come after my last question. So I want to ask you about your advices, specific, not only to the organizations or leaders, also to the women who want to grow in technology, in the organizations or in their own business. And could you give us some top three advices they have to follow?
Yeah, so I would say top three. I would say, when you join, seek out mentors and sponsors. If an organization doesn't have a formal program, seek it out. Seek out, and it's not either or. Seek out a mentor, and then earn a sponsor. So I would say that would be number one. The second would be, network, get to know people. Just sitting in front of your desk and doing the work is not enough. You've got to build relationships. So do that, and build your brand. Communicate and build your brand in terms of what you're all about. And then I would say the last piece would be, well, actually two more. One would be, ask for what you want. Raise your hand and don't be afraid. Ask for what you want, and then seek out male allies, because I think if you share your stories with male allies, like the example that I shared with the leader, nobody wants to have people feel uncomfortable in the workplace. So seek out male allies, share your stories. I know it's hard, but do that, because I think that will help to change the culture. So that's my advice for women. So did you also ask me about for leaders in general, or
Yes,
just?
absolutely.
I mean, I think what you said, I mean, you are a model, you're a role model. I think, intentionality is absolutely critical. The way you said you go about and tell people that I'm willing to wait, I'm not going to compromise. I think you have to be intentional. I think you have to hold people accountable, just as you did, hold teams accountable. And I think the last one would be address your culture, because it is the lack of inclusivity in the culture that causes. It's not lack of qualified women, it's not lack of qualified women at all. It's a lack of inclusivity, lack of basically a hostile work culture. So work on the culture, which means bring men along. So I think those would be my top advice for leaders and for women.
Thank you. Let me go to the questions. There is one question I can see at the moment. There is a significant gender imbalance when it comes to opportunities for women when they are the main lead on childcare or a single parent. Company policies and working environments doesn't support women to balance childcare and career progression, which often blocks their progress. How can companies change this?
Yeah, so I'm just going back and just looking at my notes. I gave you the India example, right? Which I think was pretty telling, because what I mentioned was that in India, what they did was they had flexible work opportunities, because a lot of these jobs don't have to be done in person. What they also did was to give sabbaticals, but and longer maternity leave. So they stayed in touch with women during their maternity leave and during the sabbaticals, so that they didn't lose touch. The women didn't lose touch, and then brought them back into the workplace. So I think it's very important that company policies recognize, this sort of gender imbalance in terms of childcare, etc., because that can block. And also, don't mistake that because women have these multiple roles, that they're not ambitious. Women are very ambitious, but they just need some support to get to the starting line. If the culture, if the environment in the country or in their home doesn't allow sort of a balanced gender role, they need some support to get to the starting line, so that companies have to provide that if they want good talent. So I think those are some examples of what companies can do. And it's often incumbent on the individual managers, and very often managers think that taking flex time or taking a longer maternity or taking a sabbatical means that someone's not committed. That's not the case. It is, as this person asks, as Helen said, so there is a gender imbalance in terms of what women are expected to do in many, many parts of the world. And I think company policies can recognize and address that, particularly in technology roles, where a lot of work can be done virtually.
Yes, I think companies and also governments in some countries,
That's
you
good.
need more regulative support. In my
Childcare,
time,
providing
yeah,
childcare also, right?
yeah, for childcare, maternity leave. When I was on maternity leave, it was 6 months for Turkey, and I was just in a senior position getting promoted. I was so nervous that I will lose the next promotion. So I even has to go earlier than the 6 months, and the regulations were not strong enough that I can protect my next steps within the company. But when you see governments are taking more and more progress on it, and again, inclusive culture plays an important role for the companies. As much as they are inclusive, they also apply that kind of company procedures that they allow the woman to take care or to work flexible and take more time for their maternity and so on.
Can I just
And
add one thing, Burchin? And I know there's one
please,
more question, but if I can just add one thing. So, one organization that I worked with, okay, they actually had um, paternity leave even on the books. So, just, maternity leave and paternity leave. So, parental leave, okay, it was on the books. Obviously, the culture was not conducive to anybody taking it, right? Rarely had men or fathers, using it to the extent. So they had every policy, progressive policy in the books. But to the extent that I know that women who were on business trips and had children would actually hide in the bathroom to talk to their children, because they didn't want anybody to know that if they were at a dinner, they'd get up and go into the restroom in order to talk to their children, because they didn't want people to think that, oh, she's is not committed to the work or to the meeting with the minister because has children. Now, think about this. When men take time off to take their children to a soccer game or go to a recital or to talk to their son or daughter on the phone, they're patted on the back. It's seen as wonderful. What a wonderful father. He's so involved with his children. When the mother had to do this, she had to hide it because the culture was not conducive. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things that we've got to be really mindful of, because, I think organizations can have the best policies, but if the culture is not one that, endorses those policies, if there are no role models, then, it's for nothing. So,
that's really very fair point. There is another question from Lise.
yeah.
Liz, she is the global DNI for Pluxee. She's
Mm-hmm.
heading Pluxee. Just to introduce her to you. Thank you, Rohini, for this inspiring talk. How do you react to more and more people reacting negatively
Mm-hmm.
to DEI actions around the world, accusing them to be wokeism
Wokeism.
related?
Yeah. And there's one more. I think Corin has one there as well. So we can
Yeah, maybe I'd read this for both of them. Does hybrid and less office-based work help or hinder the potential for women in tech?
So let me just answer that one from Corinne first. Does it help or hinder? I think the jury is out about that, because on the one hand, it provides, women with flexibility that's needed very often. On the other hand, it diminishes their visibility. So if you have an organization where it's only women primarily taking the hybrid work options, it diminishes their visibility in the organization. It prevents sponsorship opportunities, it prevents networking opportunities for them. So I think organizations have to be very careful even about hybrid work in terms of measuring who's taking it, getting the data to see who's availing themselves of it. If you see predominantly women doing it, make sure they're provided other supports to allow them for that networking and sponsorship. So it really is a mixed bag. On the one hand, it provides a flexibility that's needed, that allows them to manage these gender roles that we just talked about. But on the other hand, it's not that straightforward. So that's the answer to that. So in answer to Lizzie's question about how do you react to the negativity around wokeism, the accusations of wokeism. I think what's disturbing is, and I have to end on a positive note, but what's disturbing is that, these are very organized movements, and, particularly in the United States, they're well funded and they're very well organized. The positive to that is that, look, DEI or diversity was never main stage. Now it is, to the point that you actually have these organized movements against it. So it's something to be contended with, which is a positive. But it is very disturbing, because not only is it, reacting negatively, but it's laws that are being passed that are dismantling DEI. I'm talking about the United States, and I'll get to the other parts of the world in a minute. And I think that's extremely disturbing. It's discouraging, and there's sort of active movements to dismantle DEI. This is when we need organizations to step up, because at the end of the day, organizations listen to their people. When you talk about the next generations wants companies. They want to work for companies that are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They want to work for companies that have an ESG commitment. They want to work for companies that are socially responsible. Companies listen to employees, to people. So this is where I think companies can actually lead in a space where they have these movements that are loud, that are vocal, and there are laws. So I'm talking again in the United States. In other parts of the world, I've been heartened to see that the results of some of the elections, right? The UK for one, so this is a movement that I think can and will favor DEI, right? You see that in other parts of the world as well. You see it in India, where where a government, now there is more of a coalition government, and where minority religions, for instance, may have more of an opportunity. So I think there's this a plus and minus that's going on. All I can say is this is a time when we need each and every person, every single ally, more now than ever, to really focus on these issues. We need organizations to step up and speak up and listen to their employees, because it's the younger generations in particular that are really going to make a difference in how organizations approach this, regardless of the noise and the external environment. I hope that answers the question, Lizzie.
Yes, I think we have no more questions. Anything you want to add, Rohini, before we close?
Well, I just want to say thank you, Burchin, because I think you are a real role model for, just for CEOs in general, in terms of how you approach this work, your intentionality, your desire to mentor and sponsor and to give back. So I think there's many CEOs that can learn their lessons from you and what you've done and what in your organization. So always happy to have this conversation with you, and thank you for inviting me. And to all of those listening in, thank you. I think this was a rich dialogue, so appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing all your insights and experience and examples with us. Really, it means a lot for us. And as I told at the beginning, you have always inspired me. And I think let's continue our efforts, our commitments. One day, I hope the next generation will take over from us,
Yes.
and we will be watching them and really seeing the more progress. Thank you, Rohini. Thank you for your time. All
Thank
the
you.
best. Thank you
Take
for
care.
joining us.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.